We're looking at a high-stakes question for global family offices. How do you maintain access to mainland China's long-term growth potential without creating the appearance of retreat, anxiety, or defensive repositioning? The core argument is simple. Traditional hedging often fails in sovereign-managed systems because visible defense can itself trigger scrutiny. So the smarter approach is not obvious de-risking, it is embedded resilience. In this framework, resilience is built into the operating architecture so quietly and so efficiently that it does not distort the investment posture. Instead of separating growth and protection into two visible agendas, the system integrates both. That means preserving exposure to mainland opportunity while also preparing for disruption through invisible, low-friction optionality. The first pillar is a dual-interface topology. Hong Kong sits at the center of the visible structure. It functions as the front-facing interface for China opportunity sourcing, policy-aligned deployment, and relationship management. In other words, it signals continuity, commitment, and long-term compounding intent. At the same time, Hong Kong also serves as a regulatory and structuring layer where strategic control can remain centralized, even if assets are distributed across a broader custody network. That creates an important advantage: distributed holdings with unified command. Behind that visible front end, complementary jurisdictions serve more specialized functions. Singapore can absorb reporting, non-China allocations, and institutional custody within a stable, neutral, and highly predictable regulatory environment. Dubai can serve as an extreme contingency node, a warm standby option with high operational independence, zero capital gains tax, and full foreign ownership structures. But the key is discipline. These jurisdictions should not be overemphasized too early. If backup nodes become too visible, the structure begins to communicate strategic retreat. And once the market or regulators interpret that signal, the architecture loses stealth. The second pillar is the physics of capital flow. In sovereign-controlled networks, it is not only the size of capital that matters, it is the pattern of movement. Detection risk rises not in a straight line, but disproportionately when capital moves too quickly or deviates too sharply from established routes. That means capital velocity becomes a strategic control variable. A useful operating ceiling in this framework is to keep quarterly reallocations across jurisdictions or sectors in the range of roughly 10 to 12%. Below that level, movements are more likely to blend into routine market activity and policy-normalized channels. Above it, scrutiny can rise very quickly. Reviews intensify, delays grow, and the narrative around the movement becomes more difficult to manage. Gradualism, then, is not simply conservative behavior. It is structural camouflage. This is also where compliance becomes more than a legal requirement. It becomes conductivity. If a family office embeds documentation into deal origination, exceeds minimum reporting expectations, and maintains audit-ready structures, it builds trust with the system. That trust lowers friction. It shortens processing time. It reduces interpretive anxiety during volatile periods. In this model, compliance is not a cost center. It is a compounding asset. Equally important is the use of policy-normalized conduits. Rather than improvising new pathways for every shift in allocation, capital should move through established channels already embedded in the broader policy framework. These channels help transform what might otherwise appear discretionary or unusual into something routine and legible within the system's own operating logic. The third pillar is invisible contingency. Traditional contingency planning often produces static reserves, dormant accounts, or visible defensive structures that create drag and attract attention. The more effective model is latent readiness. In other words, You maintain backup banking relationships, secondary custody arrangements, and side pocket vehicles at low but meaningful intensity, ready for expansion only when the operating environment truly deteriorates. A useful readiness range in this framework is around 18 to 22% of liquid network capacity. Too little, and the system can fragment under stress. Too much, and the contingency layer becomes visible enough to trigger balancing behavior or signal mistrust. The objective is not maximum redundancy. It is metastable readiness. Enough capacity to activate quickly, but quiet enough to remain operationally invisible. Activation itself should not be triggered by headlines or emotion. It should be tied to administrative indicators. Cross-border settlement delays, regulatory processing extensions, growing custody friction, and longer audit cycles all provide better signals than political noise. When primary pathway efficiency deteriorates over time, then the standby network can begin a phased activation. That phase change should be gradual. When efficiency weakens but remains manageable, pathways can simply be pre-warmed with low-intensity testing and relationship maintenance. If efficiency falls further, dormant banking lines can begin handling incremental new deployment. If conditions deteriorate more severely, a portion of new capital can be redirected through backup jurisdictions. But existing mainland positions should remain undisturbed whenever possible. That stability matters. Touching legacy positions too quickly can itself become the signal that changes the environment. The fourth pillar is narrative. Communication is not cosmetic. It functions as infrastructure. The words used internally and externally shape how strategy is interpreted by regulators, counterparties, principals, and operating teams. In this kind of system, lexical discipline has real financial consequences. That means the language of de-risking, hedging, capital preservation, and contingency should be removed from visible materials. Instead, structural evolution should be framed in the language of regional integration, policy alignment, access optimization, and long-term compounding. The architecture may be defensive underneath, but the narrative must remain opportunity first. This reduces friction, preserves confidence, and keeps execution capacity intact. Messaging should also be centralized. If too many voices describe the strategy differently, lexical drift begins to create interpretive risk. Meanwhile, the deeper contingency architecture should be disclosed only on a need-to-know basis to senior investment leadership and next-generation family principals. And even then, it should be framed not as emergency planning, but as advanced stewardship education. That framing preserves institutional calm while building capability. The fifth pillar is execution. The framework works best when deployed in phases over roughly 18 months. In the foundation phase, the office establishes the Hong Kong structures, begins relevant applications, puts in place monitoring systems, and keeps capital reallocation velocity contained. In the integration phase, Singapore and Dubai relationships are quietly activated at low intensity. Sector exposure is aligned with domestic policy tailwinds, and communication discipline is enforced. In the stabilization phase, standby capacity is locked into the desired range. Trigger dashboards are operationalized, and the architecture transitions from build-out to continuous maintenance. That final point is crucial. This is not a static design. It is a living routing protocol. It requires quarterly review, micro-calibration, and constant alignment across allocation, compliance, messaging, and operational readiness. The goal is equilibrium, not one-time optimization. So, what is the larger conclusion? The challenge of maintaining mainland China access while preparing for disruption is not just geopolitical, it is architectural. Traditional hedging fails because it makes resilience visible. Embedded resilience succeeds because it is fused into the same system that generates returns. It allows a family office to keep compounding within China's opportunity set while preserving optionality if conditions change. In a world where visibility invites scrutiny, discretion becomes a source of edge. And in that environment, the greatest advantage is not simply capital scale. It is structural patience. If you found this analysis useful, please like, share, and subscribe to the XFO Intelligence podcast channel. And if you have feedback, questions, or topics you want us to cover next, email us at xfointelligence@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.